Good morning, it's Friday the 23rd of October and it's time for Boris's Best of British Bulletin. And I'm afraid it's quite lengthy. I said last week that my biggest regret about this bulletin is the events which inspire it. But this week it's the fact that I had to edit out about 1/3 of the events for the sake of brevity. Yes, there was just too much Tory bellendry this week to cover it all. In Scots Tory news, well, I suppose firstly I've got to congratulate them for last week, as they didn't even merit a single mention. Maybe they just had a quiet and competent week. Maybe it was just that Westminster bellendry was so prominent that I didn't notice what they were up to. But don't worry, normal service is resumed. Scots Tory branch office supervisor Dross MP was on the telly box quite a bit last week. And in both cases, Dross MP had his ass handed to him by ministers from those pesky devolved governments. The first to hand him his hoop was Welsh Health Minister Vaughan Gethens on Politics Live.
I've got Douglas Ross, Conservative MP, here in the studio. Douglas, listening to that, how do you respond?
Well, I'm still unclear what the Labour government's position is in Wales. The First Minister is saying they could close the borders, yet the Health Secretary is suggesting that's not going to be an option. And
well, he wants legal restrictions to travel, not just from Liverpool, but perhaps also Nottinghamshire, the North East, anybody travelling to Wales, probably heading there for half-term.
But the reference that this was able to be done before was at a time when, I mean, if you walked around London, you barely saw a car. This was when there was a national lockdown and no one was travelling, so it was very easy to identify the very small numbers who were. We're now suggesting that if you close the border, what about people who live in Wales but work in England, or live in England and work in Wales? What happens to them? And it just seems a very unclear message, and I didn't get to the bottom of what the position with the Labour Party and the Labour government in Wales is.
Vaughan?
Well, that's a deliberate misunderstanding of the position. And we can either have a sensible conversation, we can pretend that things are being said when they're not. The ability to travel for work between areas where people do work, we have never restricted that. Essential travel for work has always been permitted, apart from at the start of the March lockdown. We were talking about the state and local rules we had in place through a good part of the summer when other travel was permitted. This isn't that difficult. Our police were able to enforce the rules and people respected those rules. This is about whether we're prepared to keep people safe with very clear evidence that we are seeing importation of coronavirus from high prevalence areas within the UK. And of course, we've done this already with international quarantine measures, where every government within the UK agrees on a series of measures because we recognise that in the higher prevalence areas in other parts of the world, there is a risk of COVID being re-imported into our communities where there isn't the same extent. And of course, we've seen direct evidence of that importation from Greek islands and a range of other holiday destinations. There's a very clear logic about how all four governments have behaved up to this point in time.
That glicket look on the split screen was priceless, wasn't it? Next up was our very own SNP Finance Minister Kate Forbes, who delivered onto Dross MP a second helping of his own arse. But not before Dross attempted some sneaky editing on the Scotch Tory branch office social cleansing. Sorry, did I say social cleansing? I meant social media channels.
Say you were waiting for the Chancellor to outline any further support you could give. The Chancellor has now said Scotland will get £700 million. So why then today did Nicola Sturgeon announce it would still just be £40 million going to the businesses that are affected? This is really important to the businesses that are watching this, because I spoke to them on Monday. I had a virtual summit with businesses and they are crying out for help, and they're crying out for help now. So give them that £700 million you've got from the Chancellor.
Doesn't he look in command and authoritative? Well, let's see the unedited version.
But when it comes to financial support, Douglas mentioned a short while ago about business support in this break period that we've got, 2-week period. One of the challenges was waiting for the Chancellor to make an announcement last Friday on what they were going to do in terms of additional financial support.
That's not fair.
And because it's one of our primary sources for the Scottish Government, it's our primary source of funding, that is the primary means by which we have to compensate and mitigate the effects. Now, we largely work together quite cooperatively, but I think it's ludicrous that just as we're seeing the rate of infection increase and the likelihood of restrictions, greater restrictions, we're seeing the end of what has been a lifeline. And I accept, I've been open and honest that it has been a lifeline for many businesses. Now is not the time to end it. Everybody can see it. Every business the length and breadth of the country can see it. but the Chancellor can't appear to see it, no matter how many times it's put to him.
But Kate, in fairness, you and the Labour Party welcomed when the Chancellor announced the replacement to furlough. You both welcomed it at the time, and you said it was right that there was a replacement, there was no cliff edge. But to say you were waiting for the Chancellor to outline any further support you could give, the Chancellor has now said Scotland will get £700 million
on Friday,
more.
And I was thankful for it.
So why then today did Nicola Sturgeon announce it would still just be £40 million going to the businesses that are affected? £40 million that won't be available until
You do appreciate that's for health.
Sorry, Kate.
It's for health, and it's not just for business support.
Kate, it's not.
It's not just for business support.
It's for the £3,000 grants that the UK government are giving to businesses in England that you could give to businesses in Scotland. They are waiting right now. They've had to wait 10 days.
Well, 2 points.
Sorry, Kate, if I can just finish, because this is really important to the businesses that are watching this, because I spoke to them on Monday. I had a virtual summit with businesses, and they are crying out for help, and they're crying out for help now. So give them that £700 million you've got from the Chancellor, or give them some of the...
That does not understand
Kate,
the £700 million. But that's based on an absurd position.
Well, give them some of the £250 million that you haven't spent.
I know, but that's based on inaccuracy.
Or the Digital Connectivity Fund.
Why
not spend that?
Hang on, if you both talk at the same time, no one can hear. Let's let Kate answer. You've made your point. Let's let Kate answer.
The 2 points I would make is, one, small grants of £1,500 is no replacement for the furlough scheme. That's point number one. Point number two is that £700 million, worth asking the Chancellor, that does not just cover business support. That's for health, that's for transport, and a whole host of other things, so just for clarity. The third point is that the business support we've put in place is more generous than the UK government support. It is. The facts are there. Now, at the moment in the rest of the UK, if you're obliged by law to close, you'll get a grant. But all the businesses in the supply chain won't get funding, and other businesses that are not directly impacted won't get funding. In Scotland, we've provided funding for the businesses required to close by law, but also the businesses in the supply chain and the businesses that might see reduced trading but aren't required to close by law. And I think that's the breadth of support that we need to see. But let's not kid ourselves. £1,500 of grant, as important as it is no replacement for the furlough scheme.
Doesn't she make him look like a prize plum? Yes, you can see the truth is quite far from Dross MP being in command and authoritative. Actually, he was fucking told how it really is. He was told that the 700 million was for everyone, mate, not just business. And he was told by the back door that he needs some media training. In response, Conservative HQ have swung into action and immediately put Dross MP on some intensive media training. His next TV appearance will be the CBeebies bedtime story. Maybe if that goes well, he can work his way all the way up to Blue Peter. Dross then took to social media to complain about the rollout of the flu jab in Scotland, and round another attack on the SNP. Only it didn't go too well. Most of the responses were from people who are actually very impressed with the service and found the COVID-safe vaccination clinics slicker than ever. From my own experience, the COVID-safe jab clinic has never been better, and I hope they do it like this every year. Boris Johnson announced a new 3-tier lockdown system, with the lowest tier being medium, kind of like at McDonald's. As part of the announcement, the Chief Medical Officer reassuringly said the plan wouldn't work. The government said, in all cases, we are following the science. But it was revealed that the SAGE Science Committee told the government to lock down weeks ago. But that particular bit of science wasn't followed very far. SAGE went on to say that the government's world-beating £12 billion test and trace system was only having a marginal impact on transmission rates. Baroness Dido fucking Harding, head of seemingly everything, said test and trace would be local by default and be highly efficient. She then handed £12 billion to Serco, which is highly effective, charging us £7,360 per day for consultants to trace COVID infections, which they aren't doing. Serco's CEO is the brother of an ex-Tory MP. His brother is a Tory donor. Serco's ex-head of PR is now a Tory health minister. Now, if you feel all of this is a bit corrupt, you can complain to the government's anti-corruption champion, John Penrose MP, who is married to Baroness Dido fucking Harding. Time for my weekly reminder that the Scottish Government Test and Trace programme runs just fine on an app that costs 16 times less than the UK version, but somehow works better. Even using our actual NHS and local health authorities to perform contact tracing, which they are managing at well over 90%, without awarding any multi-billion-pound contracts to any political donors whatsoever. Meanwhile, an investigation by the Good Law Project found PPE suppliers owned by Tory donors or associates were paid 30% more per item than similar businesses globally. In June, the government gave a contract for PPE worth £32 million to Pestfix, a sweet warehouse with assets of £18,000. The government paid 75% up front, and the delivered materials turned out to be faulty. The government has since awarded 5 additional PPE contracts to Pestfix worth £313 million. The government is now being sued to find out why it's covertly handing out almost £350 million to a crisp warehouse for PPE it has proved it cannot supply. And Pestfix is using the very £350 million the government gave them to pay lawyers to stop us finding out why it got the £350 million in the first place. They still have not delivered any usable PPE. Now I'm telling you, if this smells a bit whiffy, place a call to John Penrose MP, the Conservative government's anti-corruption champion. He's your fella. He'll get to the bottom of it for shizzle. A Tory MP said, "I think it's obvious this government is happier picking fights than governing." Another said Boris Johnson prefers to get on with dog walking and lets Dominic do the work. Chastened by reports that local authorities were only given 5 minutes notice of previous lockdowns, this time the government gave them 7 minutes notice of the meeting to discuss it. Except some MPs didn't even get that, and were only invited after the meeting had already started. For example, the government invited the MP for Sunderland, who had to inform them once she arrived that she was only one of 3 Sunderland MPs. The government was surprised to be informed of this. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer said the infection rate at the north never dropped, meaning the relaxation of lockdown was at the expense of lives up north. Then the government said they would devolve more decision making and give more financial aid to local authorities. But that aid was conditional on the devolved local authority doing what the government wants, which is a bit of a novel definition of devolved. Now perhaps people in England will understand how Scotland feels. So, following criticism, the government briefed the press that it was going to consult more with regional governments. Literally 2 hours later, the government briefed the press that Manchester was moving into Tier 3 restrictions. The Mayor of Manchester was not consulted or even informed about a decision he must implement, and which affects the largest city region outside London. Boris Johnson said he'd liaise with local regions and provide improved financial support. He then forgot to liaise with local regions and actually cut their financial support. Boris Johnson said, "Whatever happens, nobody gets less than 93% of their current income." People get a maximum of 67% of their current income. The government said it would stop at nothing to support people in Tier 3 areas. The government stopped at £7.85 per person in Manchester. By contrast, Robert Jenrick improperly arranged a £25 million gift to his own constituency. That's £237 per head, 30 times as much as Manchester, and that was pre-COVID. And Boris Johnson had previously paid £100,000 of public money for IT advice from Jennifer Arcuri, who this week admitted they were actually having an affair. Anyway, the Mayor of Manchester didn't ask for such largesse or even offer a pole dance for the Prime Minister. He just asked Manchester to get the same amount of money per person that has been given to neighbouring Lancashire. Boris Johnson said he completely understands why Andy Burnham objects to this settlement, and then Boris Johnson stopped understanding and said Andy Burnham was playing politics, and therefore he would impose direct rule on the region's democratically elected mayor. So Brexiters, who for years insisted we could strike great deals around the world, then immediately failed in negotiations with Manchester and Wales. Even the Manchester young Tories were not best pleased, as this now deleted tweet shows. Thank goodness for screenshots. I'd just like to point out to the people of Manchester, though, there is an alternative. The Home Office announced plans to catch migrants in a big net, and then Lord West reassuringly said, "We need to deal with migrants in a concentrated place, a camp or whatever." But he didn't mention whether the Arbeit macht frei would actually be the camp motto. Speaking of dates, last Thursday, the 15th of October, was the absolute irremovable deadline for trade talks that mighty, fearsome Boris Johnson laid down to the cowed and quivering EU in a move that surprised absolutely no one. Talks have continued because, well, obviously, duh. This is the third absolute deadline imposed by the British that has been missed because the British have temporarily inverted arse and elbow. This didn't stop the Cabinet Office Minister, Lord Agnew, from berating haulage businesses for not being ready for Brexit on the 1st of January. The Road Haulage Association pointed out that they only have 1,668 of the 33,000 EU haulage permits they need on the 1st of January. Software to control our borders won't be ready until 4 months after the 1st of January, and the government is still in the planning stage of the Kent passports we will need on the 1st of January. And construction of Kent's world's largest lorry park is behind schedule, so probably not ready in the 1st of January. Fortunately, the government is well prepared and plans to install thousands of portaloos in Kent, the Garden of England, to be used by lorry drivers trapped in the impending 2-day queues. But at least we've now got back control, and therefore we can level up the playing field by implementing the government's landmark digital tax on giants such as Amazon. This week the government announced that Amazon will be exempt from the digital tax. Speaking of tax exemptions, it was revealed that Dominic Cummings has had a £30,000 council tax bill written off because he built the house illegally, so it doesn't count as a real house or something like that. And on the subject of extreme dodgy dealing, let me direct your attention to Robert Jenrick, who set up the £3.6 billion Towns Fund for the 101 most deprived towns, and then gave the maximum grant of £25 million to his own constituency, which is the 270th most deprived town. His explanation was that he, Jenrick, did not make the decision. It was made by a colleague, Jake Berry. And in a move that shocked absolutely no one, Jake Berry also got money for his constituency, and in one of those astounding coincidences that seem to float around Robert Jenrick a lot. That decision was made by, you've guessed it, Robert Jenrick. I tried calling John Penrose MP the Conservative anti-corruption champion, only to find that he's outsourced his anti-corruption role to fucking Serco. Brace yourself for the next one. NHS staff were polled on whether, in recognition of their efforts to fight COVID-19, they would prefer to be given a badge or a snack box. It was reported that 2 out of every 3 hospices will have to make redundancies in the middle of the pandemic. In May, Boris Johnson reassured a grateful nation that nobody will go hungry as a result of coronavirus. He then denied food to the UK's 600,000 poorest children. So Marcus Rashford, a footballist, ran a campaign to get the kids fed. Then Boris Johnson congratulated Rashford on the MBE he got for his campaign to overturn the cruel policies of Boris Johnson. And then, yesterday, Boris Johnson and his squad of cunts refused to feed the kids again. And then, because let's face it, allowing children to starve barely raises an eyebrow anymore, the government won a vote in Parliament to prevent child refugees from being reunited with their families. Because, obviously, that's helpful to... Does anybody know who that helps? Does anyone at all? And now, unexpectedly, an all-bishops finale. The Archbishop of York was denied the traditional peerage on his retirement. Did he do anything wrong? Apparently not. Is there anything objectionable about the guy? I don't know. Here's his photo. He seems like a perfectly nice chap. Could it be? No, surely not. It couldn't possibly be that he's the first black archbishop we've ever had. Surely not. It's the 21st century after all. The reason given by the government was that it needs to limit the size of the House of Lords. This was days after ennobling 36 peers, including Evgeny Lebedev, the son of a former KGB agent, Boris Johnson's little brother, Ian Botham, and Claire Fox, an unrepentant apologist for IRA terrorism who just happened to support Brexit. The fact that the government chose this time to break with this long-standing tradition is just one of those totally coincidental coincidences that seem to happen around Boris a lot. And I'm sure it's nothing to do with the colour of the former Archbishop's skin. Just like I'm sure this video, which is of course a totally freakish coincidental coincidence in which Boris Johnson chooses not to shake hands with the two guys in a long line of people, all of whom he chooses to shake hands with.
Went for the chant of "We are Europeans." He was met with near silence there, and there he is embracing his girlfriend, Carrie Simmons, not bothering.
Yes, nothing to see here. Move along, move along. Holy shit. Can all of this really just be 1 week? Well, yes it is. Sadly, this is becoming normal now. But it is 1 week. Just one painfully normal week in Tory Britain. Which leaves me with just one question. Are you yes yet? DaviePHD.